The soft evening light bathed the front of Liberty Gas in a gentle orange hue as Mr. James Walker stood behind the counter wearing a faded polo shirt and jeans that made him blend in like any other part-time worker. He scanned the register screen, tapped a few buttons, and offered a polite smile to a customer buying a soda. No one gave him a second look. And that was the point. James wasn't there to be seen. As the owner of Liberty Gas, he had made the rare decision to go undercover, an effort to truly understand what was happening on the ground. From his years in business, he had learned that the higher up you go, the harder it becomes to see what's really going on at the foundation. So he swapped his tailored suits for anonymity and chose to work shoulder to shoulder with the people he employed. What prompted this unusual decision wasn't just curiosity, it was a growing sense of unease. In the last few weeks, James had been hearing troubling stories from other station owners in the region. Thefts had increased, mostly involving stolen fuel and late-night vandalism. A few small shops had even reported pump tampering and suspicious men lurking after hours. These weren't random acts of mischief. They were precise, quiet, and hard to trace. James couldn't ignore the feeling that Liberty Gas might soon be next. And if someone was planning to target his station, he wanted to be the first to know, before any damage was done. No memo or manager's report could give him that kind of insight. He had to see it with his own eyes. From behind the counter, James began to observe everything with a new lens. He watched how customers moved through the aisles, which employees were quick to greet people, and which ones lingered too long near their phones. He noticed patterns, who was always late, who cut corners, and who seemed nervous for no obvious reason. But even more concerning were the physical signs around the property itself. One morning, he found a streak of graffiti on the station's rear wall, hastily sprayed initials that didn't mean much to most, but to James they looked like a territorial mark. A message. Then there was the storage shed out back. It had always been secure, locked tight every night, but now the latch looked tampered with, bent slightly, as if someone had tried to pry it open. James double-checked the lock, tested its resistance, and felt his stomach tighten. The changes were subtle, small enough to be overlooked if you weren't paying attention, but James was. And the more he noticed, the clearer it became that something was stirring beneath the surface of this quiet gas station. Though no actual incident had occurred yet, James's instincts told him that waiting for things to escalate would be a mistake. He started logging every detail, making private notes after each shift, including anything that felt off, shadows in the surveillance feed, unfamiliar vehicles idling too long, or deliveries that arrived slightly outside their normal schedules. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Because when you're running a business that never sleeps, you learn to read the signs before the storm. The transformation was already happening within James himself. No longer just an executive balancing budgets and reviewing quarterly reports, he was now a quiet observer of human behavior, seeing fear in glances, tension in body language, and secrets hidden in silence. And though he hadn't yet pinpointed the source of the growing threat, he was more determined than ever to uncover it. This wasn't just about protecting Liberty Gas, it was about protecting the people inside it too. The night may have seemed calm, but James knew better. Trouble doesn't announce itself. It creeps in, quiet and clever, and when it does, you better be watching. The gentle chime of the gas station's front door broke the evening stillness, echoing faintly through the aisles. James Walker looked up from the register, wiping down the counter with a rag more out of habit than necessity. In walked two teenagers, heads down and shoulders hunched like they were trying to slip through unnoticed. One was tall and wiry, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his hoodie, his nervous eyes darting around the room. The other was shorter and more solidly built, moving with a kind of stiff confidence that didn't quite reach his face. James recognized the look immediately. These weren't just kids out for soda or snacks. There was something different in the way they moved, cautious, almost calculated, and James's instincts flared to life like a spark on dry tinder. Mason, the taller of the two, drifted toward the back of the store, pretending to browse the shelves. He picked up a bag of chips, looked at it without really seeing it, then put it back. Tyler, the shorter teen, made a beeline for the soda fridge, cracking it open but not taking anything out. Instead, he leaned closer to Mason, their voices dropping to a hushed murmur. James didn't want to make them feel watched, so he casually stepped out from behind the counter, grabbing a clipboard and pretending to check the inventory on a nearby display of bottled water. From his new position, he could just barely make out their conversation. "We're not ready," Mason whispered, his voice tense. "This is stupid. We're going to screw it up." Tyler shot him a sharp look, whispering back, "We don't have a choice. You know what he said. We don't do it. It's worse." The words landed like a rock in James's gut. This wasn't the usual banter of teens plotting to sneak beer or spray paint a wall. This was something heavier. The urgency in their tone, the fear that laced every word. It wasn't an act. James felt a chill slide down his spine. He returned to the counter and pretended to sort receipts, keeping one ear tuned to the boys behind him. Their conversation continued in fragmented whispers, bits and pieces, slipping through the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "We've got the tools," Tyler muttered, trying to sound confident. "Just stick to the plan, and we'll be done in 5 minutes." Mason didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice cracked. "But what if something goes wrong?" Trying to maintain the illusion of casualness, James called out in a friendly tone, "Evening, fellas. Let me know if you need anything." The two boys froze mid-conversation. Mason gripped a soda bottle so tightly the plastic crinkled in his hand. Tyler turned, his smile forced and too quick. "Just grabbing a drink," he said, his voice slightly too high. James nodded, pretending not to notice the way Mason avoided eye contact as he followed Tyler to the register. The tension between them was thick, palpable even, and the silence that stretched across the counter was more telling than any words. When James rang up their sodas, Mason fumbled with his wallet, dropping a crumpled bill on the counter. Tyler picked it up for him, masking the clumsiness with a smirk, but James saw the tremble in Mason's hands. "Quiet night, huh?" James offered lightly, handing back their change. Tyler gave a non-committal grunt. Mason didn't speak. The boys mumbled a thank you and left in a hurry, the bell above the door jangling again as it closed behind them. James watched them disappear into the darkness, their pace too quick for comfort. He stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the counter, his eyes narrowed with thought. Something about that interaction didn't sit right. The way they whispered, the things they said, their fear, it all pointed to something more serious than teenage mischief. James had seen enough over the years to know when kids were bluffing and when they were in real trouble. These boys weren't bad kids, he could tell. They were scared. And scared kids, especially ones under pressure, were often pushed to do foolish, even dangerous things. As the night settled back into its usual rhythm, James couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. Whatever Mason and Tyler were planning, it wasn't harmless. Their fear wasn't about getting caught stealing candy. It was something deeper, something that left a knot in James's chest. He glanced at the security monitors and made a mental note of the time they had entered and left. He didn't know yet what they were up to, but he knew one thing for sure. He needed to keep an eye on those boys. Because whatever they were tangled up in, it wasn't going to end well unless someone stepped in. And James Walker had a growing feeling that person might have to be him. The moment the two teens disappeared into the night, James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten years ago when something just wasn't right in a deal. He waited a few moments before locking the cash drawer and slipping out through the side entrance of Liberty Gas, careful not to make a sound. The crisp night air bit at his cheeks as he moved into the shadows, following the boys at a safe distance. They walked quickly, heads bent close, their conversation too quiet to hear. James kept a steady pace, always staying half a block behind. Ridgewood was quiet this time of night. The occasional bark of a dog or hum of a passing car, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Streetlights flickered above, casting long, lonely shadows as the boys turned down a side road leading to a small park on the edge of town. James stopped just short of the park entrance, ducking behind a tall oak tree that offered both cover and a clear view of the dimly lit bench where the boys now sat. A single street lamp cast a pale yellow glow on them, making their hunched shoulders and fidgeting hands look even more fragile in the night. They were talking fast, clearly anxious, when the low growl of an engine interrupted the quiet. James's eyes narrowed as a rusted pickup truck rolled into the gravel lot at the park's edge. The truck creaked to a stop, and from it stepped a tall, lean man with a cigarette dangling from his lips and a scar that stretched from his temple to his jawline. He moved with the kind of practiced menace that didn't need volume to be intimidating. The teens immediately stood to attention, their nervous energy turning to visible fear. The man, Vince, strode toward them with barely restrained frustration. "Save it," he snapped, before either of them could speak. "I don't want excuses. You screw this up again, and it's not just you I'll deal with." He glared at Mason, whose hands trembled at his sides, then turned his attention to Tyler, who tried to hold his ground but was clearly shaken. Vince reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With a flick of his wrist, he threw it at Tyler, who caught it just before it hit the ground. "That's your next job," Vince growled. "Simple. Even you two can't mess it up." Tyler unfolded the paper and studied it under the street lamp's glow, his brow furrowing as he took in the details. "Tampering with the pump?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Vince exhaled smoke through his nose like a warning. "You do what I say, and nobody gets hurt. You screw up, and your families won't know what hit them." James crouched lower behind the tree, his pulse quickening. The air felt heavier now, like the world was holding its breath. Vince wasn't just some local punk. He was organized, cold, and clearly used to making threats. And the boys? They weren't criminals. They were scared kids caught in a web they didn't know how to escape from. James could feel Mason's hesitation from where he stood. The teen looked like he wanted to cry, his body stiff with dread. Tyler clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but James could see the cracks in his armor. This wasn't bravado anymore. It was survival. And that paper Vince had thrown wasn't just some empty note. It was a blueprint for sabotage, a guide for disabling a gas pump's safety mechanisms, something that, if done wrong, could cause a fire, an explosion, or worse. Before Vince could leave, he gave one final warning. "And don't think about running," he said, eyes flicking between the boys. "I've got people watching. You so much as breathe wrong, and I'll know." With that, he turned back toward his truck, the cigarette falling from his mouth as he climbed into the driver's seat. The truck's engine roared to life, and moments later, it disappeared down the road, leaving behind only the lingering stench of smoke and fear. The boys stood frozen in the park's dim light, neither of them speaking. Tyler finally folded the paper and shoved it into his pocket. Mason rubbed his arms like he was trying to shake off the chill in his bones. Then, silently, they turned and began the walk back toward town, their steps heavy with dread. James didn't move until the boys were out of sight. His knees ached from crouching, and his breath clouded in the cold night air, but he barely noticed. What he'd just witnessed confirmed everything he feared. And then some. This wasn't about teenage rebellion or mischief. Vince was using them, manipulating them with threats and fear to do his dirty work. And whatever was on that paper, it wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. James knew he couldn't let them go through with it. Not just for the safety of Liberty Gas, but for their own lives. These kids needed help, and Vince needed to be stopped. Quietly, carefully, James emerged from the shadows and began making his way back to the station, his mind already racing with what to do next. The storm was closer than ever, and it was time to prepare. The walk back to Liberty Gas felt longer than it should have. Each step James took was weighted down by what he had just witnessed. The image of Vince, the scarred man with a voice like gravel and threats sharp as knives, lingered in his mind. This wasn't some petty crook pushing teenagers into minor vandalism. This was a man running something bigger, something calculated and dangerously well coordinated. James had been in business long enough to recognize the difference between chaos and control. Vince was no random thug. He had an operation, and Mason and Tyler were just the latest pawns in a much darker game. That paper he handed them wasn't a prank or a scare tactic. It was a task, part of a system that James feared might stretch far beyond Ridgewood. By the time James reached the gas station, the air had grown colder, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above the pumps sounded unusually loud in the still night. He slipped inside through the employee entrance and locked the door behind him, every motion deliberate. His heart still beat fast, but his mind was razor-sharp. He crossed into the back office, flipped on the desk lamp, and pulled the security footage from earlier in the evening. The system wasn't cutting edge, but it had been recently upgraded, especially the camera watching Pump 6, now the centerpiece of Vince's plans. James sat down, inserted the latest footage into the player, and began scanning through the hours. The boys had lingered around Pump 6 longer than necessary, their movements awkward, their glances paranoid. James slowed the footage. Mason paced nervously near the pump, clearly unsure of what he was doing. Tyler knelt beside the pump's base, appearing to inspect it. There was no tampering, yet, but their behavior matched someone scoping out a target. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't some teenager-level mischief. The blueprints Vince handed over were meant to bypass safety systems, mechanisms designed to prevent fuel from leaking, combusting, or being illegally siphoned. Disabling those systems, even slightly, could put lives at risk. Customers, employees, anyone nearby. It wasn't just a crime, it was a potential disaster. James thought of the elderly couple who stopped by the station every Thursday evening, the young mother who came in with her toddler for chocolate milk, the night shift truckers who relied on Liberty Gas to fill up and keep moving. The idea that someone like Vince would endanger all of them for profit made James's blood boil. And it wasn't only about the safety of others, it was about the manipulation. Vince didn't just use force, he used fear. He threatened the boys' families, their sense of security, their very futures. He wrapped his crimes in desperation, making kids believe they had no other choice. That, to James, was the most dangerous kind of villainy, one that looked like necessity to those caught in it. James paused the footage, eyes fixed on the grainy image of the two boys frozen in their nervous scouting of Pump 6. He stood up and began pacing the office, his thoughts spinning. Vince had been careful, but maybe not careful enough. If the security cameras had caught this much, perhaps they could catch more. James made a list. Timestamps, odd behavior, cars that stayed too long in the lot. He began mentally cataloguing every anomaly from the past few weeks. Strange deliveries, late-night engine noises, a man who asked too many questions about pump maintenance. All of it could be connected, but he needed more than a hunch. He needed hard proof. By the time the clock ticked past 2 a.m., James had reviewed 3 separate nights of footage and made detailed notes of anything suspicious. He hadn't caught Vince on camera yet, but the movements of the boys, the pattern of their behavior, and the lingering cars all painted a disturbing picture. It wasn't just Liberty Gas in danger. This entire town might be sitting on a powder keg, and Vince was holding the match. James knew what he had to do next. He had to dig deeper, not just into the footage, but into Vince himself, who he was, how he operated, and how far his network might reach. Because if someone like Vince had already slipped into the cracks of Ridgewood unnoticed, it meant the threat wasn't just growing. It was already here. As James finally stepped away from the monitors, the weight of the situation settled fully on his shoulders. He wasn't just dealing with scared teens anymore. He was facing a criminal infrastructure that used people like fuel, burning them up for short-term gain. Vince had made a mistake coming after Liberty Gas, because James wasn't just a business owner. He was a man who'd built his station from the ground up with honesty and grit. And now it was personal. Whatever it took, James was going to bring this operation into the light, even if he had to do it alone. The early morning hours passed in a blur of preparation and tension. James Walker sat hunched in the dim back office of Liberty Gas. his eyes locked on the security monitor as he fast-forwarded through footage from earlier that night. The grainy screen displayed what he feared it would: Mason and Tyler loitering by Pump 6, their movements unmistakably deliberate. Mason paced near the pump, glancing nervously over his shoulder, while Tyler crouched low, pretending to tie his shoe, but clearly examining the pump's access panel. James froze the frame and leaned closer. He could almost feel the anxiety radiating from their posture. They hadn't done anything yet, but it was obvious they were preparing for something they didn't fully understand. Vince's instructions were already in motion, and the boys were caught in a dangerous current. Determined not to let them slip through unseen again, James made a series of small but crucial changes to the station's security system. He repositioned one of the overhead cameras for a sharper angle on Pump 6 and added a second lens behind a nearby pillar to capture anything that might be blocked from the main feed. He boosted the recording frame rate slightly, just enough to catch quick movements without alerting anyone to changes. Then he took a long breath and checked the clock. 11:18 p.m. It wouldn't be long now. James dimmed the office lights, sat down, and waited, the low hum of the monitors the only sound in the room. He didn't know if they would come, but something in his gut told him they would. Desperation had a way of forcing action, especially when fear was the one holding the leash. Outside, the station lot was quiet, almost too quiet. A few moths flitted around the overhead lamps, and the occasional breeze rattled the pump signage. As the clock crept closer to midnight, James spotted movement in the far corner of the screen. Two figures emerged from the shadows beyond the station's edge: Mason and Tyler. They walked side by side, their bodies tense, their eyes scanning every direction. Tyler had a dark canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and Mason's hands were buried deep in his hoodie pocket. The moment they stepped into the glow of the pump lights, James saw their faces clearly, and what he saw was fear. Not the casual kind kids wore when breaking curfew. This was the look of two boys standing at the edge of something they couldn't come back from. James watched closely as they approached Pump 6. Tyler dropped the bag to the ground with a soft thud and immediately began unzipping it. Mason hung back, fidgeting, his eyes bouncing between Tyler and the street beyond. Through the microphone feed, James caught fragments of their conversation. "This is a bad idea," Mason muttered. "We should just leave." Tyler's voice was sharp, but it wavered with tension. "And go where? You know what Vince said. We finish this, or it gets worse." There was a long silence before Mason finally replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we mess it up?" Tyler responded flatly. "Then we're screwed." James could feel the dread rising in his chest. The boys were standing on the edge, ready to do something that could put lives at risk and tie them even tighter to Vince's criminal network. He couldn't wait any longer. Leaving the office, James moved silently down the hallway, his heart thudding with purpose. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, stepping into the night with steady resolve. The moment his presence registered, the boys froze. Tyler fumbled to shove the tools back into the bag, while Mason looked as if he might bolt. "Evening, boys," James said, his voice calm but firm. Mason's eyes widened. "Mr. Walker," he stammered, panic in every syllable. James crossed his arms as he approached, his gaze steady. "Now how about you two tell me what you're doing out here at this hour?" Tyler's jaw tightened as he tried to form an answer, but James could see the internal struggle, the fear, the shame, the flicker of defiance that didn't quite hold. There was a long pause before either of them spoke. Tyler finally looked down, his shoulders sagging, and said, "Nothing. Just fixing something." James raised an eyebrow. "At midnight? At a pump that doesn't need fixing?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. It was clear they had no plan for being caught. But James didn't press too hard. Instead, he softened his tone. "Look, I know you're scared. I know Vince has you doing things you don't want to do. But this isn't the way." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither boy moved. Finally, Mason broke the silence, his voice cracking. "He said he'd hurt our families if we didn't." James nodded slowly, stepping closer. Then let me help you. You're not alone in this. And in that quiet, heavy moment, James saw the first crack in their fear. The first sign that maybe, just maybe, they were ready to trust someone who could pull them out. The air around Pump 6 hung thick with silence, broken only by the soft buzzing of the overhead lights and the shallow, panicked breaths of two teenagers caught in a moment they hadn't fully prepared for. James Walker stood in front of them, his arms crossed, but his expression calm, not angry, not accusatory, just steady. It was the kind of calm that made people stop running. Tyler instinctively took a step back, pushing the tool bag behind him with the tip of his foot, while Mason looked down at the concrete, as if it might offer an escape. James didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, gave them room to feel the weight of what they were about to do. Then, in a quiet voice that carried more strength than shouting ever could, he asked, "What's going on, boys? You don't need to lie to me. I already know something's not right." Tyler clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, his voice low and brittle. Mason opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, eyes flicking toward his friend. James took a step forward, not threatening, just closer. "Try me," he said gently. "I've been around long enough to know when someone's in trouble." Mason's shoulders slumped, the last bit of defiance draining from his posture. "It's Vince," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "He said if we didn't do what he told us, he'd hurt our families. He knows where we live, where our parents work." His voice cracked, and he wiped his sleeve across his eyes. Tyler looked away, his silence confirming every word. For a long moment, no one spoke. James let their confession settle in his mind. It confirmed everything he had suspected, and more. Vince wasn't just manipulating these boys, he was terrorizing them, using fear as a weapon. James felt a sharp anger rise in his chest, but he didn't let it show. Right now, these boys didn't need more fear. They needed reassurance. "I'm so sorry he put you in that position," James said softly. "But you need to hear this. You're not alone, and you don't have to keep doing what he says." "Ah," Tyler looked up, confused and guarded. "And do what instead? Run. He said he's got people watching us all the time. If we disappear, if we don't show up, he'll know." James nodded. "He might think he's got eyes everywhere, but he's not invincible. And now that I know what's happening, I can do something about it." The boys exchanged a glance, wary, unsure. James continued, "But I need your help. Not to sabotage anything, just to tell me everything you know. We can't stop him unless we understand how he operates, who he's working with, where he's moving things. I've got people who can help, people who know how to take guys like Vince down the right way, but I can't do it without you." For a moment, neither Mason nor Tyler moved. The tension was thick, their loyalty still tangled in fear. Then Mason spoke, his voice trembling but determined. "We don't want to do this anymore. We never did." Tyler nodded silently. "Then let's fix this together," James said. "You take the first step by walking away from this right now. I'll handle the rest." Slowly, Tyler reached down and zipped the tool bag closed, then stepped back from the pump. Mason followed, his relief visible in the way his shoulders lowered. James motioned for them to follow him inside, where they could talk safely, away from the dark open lot and the shadow of Vince's threats. As they walked back toward the office, the tension in the air began to shift, still present, but now laced with something new. Possibility. James had given them something Vince never could. Choice. Not a threat, not a command, but the space to decide for themselves. And tonight, they had chosen to stop running and start fighting back. Inside, under the soft glow of the office light, James handed them warm drinks and sat across the table from them, listening carefully as they began to share everything they knew. It wasn't just names and times. It was fear, confusion, guilt. It was two boys finally unloading a weight they should never have been asked to carry. And James? He listened without judgment, taking every word as both a warning and a responsibility. Because now it was no longer just about protecting Liberty Gas. It was about protecting them. And James Walker had never been more certain of what needed to be done next. Inside the quiet safety of the office, James closed the blinds, dimmed the overhead lights, and set 2 mugs of hot cocoa on the table. It was a small gesture, but in a moment like this, it mattered. Mason and Tyler sat across from him, their shoulders still tense, eyes darting around like they expected Vince to burst through the door at any second. James didn't rush them. He knew that after everything they'd just gone through, trust wasn't something you demanded. It had to be earned. Slowly, Tyler reached into the canvas bag he'd brought earlier that night, unzipped it with trembling fingers, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward James like it was a bomb that might go off if handled too quickly. Mason looked away, his hands clenched in his lap. James unfolded the paper and studied it under the desk lamp. The diagram was crude but detailed, clearly drawn by someone who understood fuel systems intimately. It showed how to open a maintenance panel beneath Pump 6, disconnect a pressure sensor, and reroute the flow to a hidden siphon hose without triggering any alarms. There were small notations in the margins, timing instructions, warnings about heat and pressure levels, and a scribbled reminder. Don't touch valve B unless it's already primed. James stared at the page in disbelief. This wasn't the kind of thing 2 teenage boys could come up with. Someone had built this plan, tested it, and handed it off with chilling precision. Vince wasn't just a bully with a temper. He was orchestrating something calculated and dangerous. As James looked up from the paper, Tyler finally spoke. His voice was tight, like he was still fighting the urge to hold back. It's not just about fuel, he said. We've heard him on the phone, a lot. He uses the pumps for drop-offs, stuff hidden in trucks, sometimes buried in the storage tanks. We don't know what it is exactly, but we heard him say something about product needing to move before midnight. And last time, when we helped him at another station, we saw a guy take a case out of the fuel shed. It wasn't tools, Mr. Walker. It looked like chemicals or something. James didn't interrupt. He just nodded slowly, piecing the picture together in his mind. And he always talks about shipments, Mason added. He never says what they are, but he's always nervous before they go out. One time, he said if anything leaks, it could bring the feds. James sat back in his chair, the paper still in his hand, but his mind far ahead. If what the boys were saying was true, and every instinct told him it was, then Vince wasn't just stealing fuel. He was using gas stations as front operations for something much bigger. The GPS trackers, the hidden compartments, the precise timing, it all pointed to a network, possibly interstate, using legitimate businesses to move contraband undetected. Drugs seemed like the most likely answer, but James couldn't rule out the possibility of chemicals, weapons, or even counterfeit materials. Whatever it was dangerous, and Vince had turned Liberty Gas into a ticking time bomb without anyone's knowledge. And yet, what rattled James even more was how invisible it all was. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. The customers kept coming, the transactions processed, the deliveries arrived on schedule. But underneath that surface, beneath the humming lights and the smiling service, was a pipeline for something illegal, protected by threats and silence. James folded the diagram carefully and tucked it into a file folder. He didn't need to see any more to know that the threat had evolved beyond his business. This was about the safety of the community, about 2 boys who'd nearly been turned into criminals before their lives had even started, about a man like Vince, using fear like a crowbar to pry open everything good and honest about the town. I need you both to stay here for the rest of the night, James said, rising to his feet. No phones, no outside contact. If Vince thinks you bailed on the job, he might come looking, but we're going to be ready for him. Tyler and Mason nodded in silent agreement, the relief evident in their faces now that someone was finally listening, finally doing something. James turned toward the back of the office where the security systems were stored and began preparing the next steps. Tonight wasn't just about stopping 2 kids from making a mistake. It was about unraveling the whole damn scheme and making sure no one else got pulled into it. As the clock on the wall ticked past 1 a.m., James's resolve hardened. This wasn't about Liberty Gas anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking down Vince, piece by piece. The clock on the wall read 4:32 a.m. when James stepped out into the cold, damp morning air, flashlight in hand, and made his way across the empty lot to Pump 6. The stillness outside felt almost unnatural, like the quiet was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. The air was thick with dew, and a low fog had settled over the edges of the lot, casting an eerie glow beneath the overhead lights. James knelt beside the pump and ran his hand along the metal panel, remembering the details from the diagram Tyler and Mason had surrendered hours earlier. He moved carefully, unscrewing a narrow latch near the base, and with a little force, the panel opened. Inside, tucked between the standard wiring and circuit boards, was something that didn't belong, a small black device with a blinking red light. It was a GPS tracker, no doubt about it. James stared at it for a moment, the implications settling deep in his gut. Vince wasn't just stealing fuel or using the station as a drop point. He was monitoring every move, every gallon, every truck. He had turned Liberty Gas into a surveillance node in a criminal network. James didn't touch the tracker. He knew better than to tamper with evidence, especially something this potentially sensitive. Instead, he closed the panel and backed away, making sure everything looked exactly as it had before. As he stepped into the shadows near the edge of the building, his phone buzzed once. Just a quick vibration. A text from Frank, his contact with the state police. "Be ready. If he's watching, he'll come before sunrise." James tucked the phone away, adjusted his coat collar, and leaned against the cold metal wall, eyes locked on the lot, waiting. And not 10 minutes later, the distant hum of an engine broke the silence. A dark SUV rolled slowly into the lot, its headlights slicing through the fog like knives. It didn't park near the storefront or the pumps where normal customers would. Instead, it idled along the far edge of the property, near the maintenance entrance, where visibility was lowest. James tightened his jaw and stepped deeper into the shadows. The driver's door opened, and Vince stepped out, his silhouette unmistakable even in the low light. He moved with the same predatory confidence James had witnessed in the park, measured, precise, and utterly without hesitation. A second door opened, and a larger man, broad-shouldered and tattooed across both forearms, climbed out behind him. No words were exchanged. They didn't need any. They had a job to do, and clearly they'd done it before. Vince walked straight to Pump 6, crouched low, and ran his fingers along the same panel James had inspected minutes earlier. He tapped his phone a few times, and the GPS tracker inside the pump gave off a faint beep, barely audible from where James was hidden. It was a signal, confirmation, that the system was still active. The larger man stood nearby, scanning the lot, flashlight in hand. He swept it back and forth with methodical precision, the beam cutting through the fog and passing within feet of James's position. James didn't move. He barely breathed. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his instincts kept him calm, grounded. He watched as Vince inspected the tracker's signal on his phone, clearly checking whether any tampering had occurred. Satisfied, Vince nodded once to his man, then stepped back from the pump. "Everything's in place," Vince said, his voice low but unmistakably sharp. "Next run's on schedule." The henchman grunted in acknowledgement, turning to scan the shadows once more. James held his position, his body pressed against the cold steel of the building, heart thudding behind his ribs. He wished he had a better camera, a zoom lens, something, anything, to capture the scene playing out before him. But for now, what mattered most was what he could confirm. Vince was running his operation in real time. This was no rumor, no suspicion. This was fact unfolding in front of him. As Vince and the other man turned to head back to the SUV, James caught one last detail, something that made the knot in his stomach tighten. Vince paused, looked around the lot, then muttered, "Keep your eyes on the kids. If they flinch, we cut them loose and find new ones. No second chances." The enforcer nodded. And just like that, they climbed back into the vehicle, the engine revving low as they disappeared into the fog once more. The lot returned to silence, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that left you with questions, tension, and the haunting knowledge that someone had looked into the dark and found exactly what they feared. James stayed in place for a few moments longer, allowing the tension to ebb before he finally stepped back into the open. He walked slowly to the pump, kneeling once again, but this time not to investigate. This time he simply looked. What had once been a simple piece of his business was now the centerpiece of something criminal, something dangerous. But now he had something he didn't before. Proof. Not in the form of a video or a photo, but in his own eyes and memory. Vince had come, had checked the tracker, had confirmed the schedule. James's next move had to be just as calculated. He wasn't going to stop Vince by catching him in the act of one crime. He needed the whole puzzle, and tonight he'd just found a critical piece. The office at Liberty Gas was still cloaked in the pre-dawn quiet when James Walker returned from the shadows, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed. He moved with a sense of urgency now, not panic, but purpose, because the pieces were finally starting to fit together. He closed the door behind him, sat at the monitor bank, and began scrubbing through security footage from the last 2 weeks, frame by frame. As he documented each instance Vince's SUV had appeared at the station, a pattern emerged like ink seeping through paper. Vince's visits weren't random. They coincided precisely with late-night deliveries to nearby businesses. Every time a truck dropped off supplies at a store or restaurant within a few blocks, Vince would roll in, check the tracker at Pump 6, and vanish before dawn. It was meticulous. Too meticulous to be coincidence. James realized then what Vince had been doing, using the cover of legitimate deliveries to run illegal cargo, likely hidden in or disguised as fuel shipments. The pump wasn't just a siphoning point, it was a gate in a larger network. With a folder full of notes, diagrams, timestamps, and footage, still images, James slid into his pickup truck and drove to a small diner on the edge of town. It was nearly 6 a.m. when he walked through the glass doors and spotted Frank Dalton already seated in the corner booth. Frank, a retired state trooper with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense demeanor, had been James's quiet ally for years. If anyone could help navigate the next steps, it was him. James slid into the booth, set the folder on the table, and didn't waste a second. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, opening the folder and laying out the evidence. Frank's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the notes, his jaw tightening as he saw the tracker diagram. "You're telling me he's moving something, probably drugs, under cover of fuel deliveries?" James nodded. "And it's not just Liberty Gas. If the pattern holds, there could be other stations involved. Tonight's the window. He's coming back." Frank leaned back, his coffee untouched. "We'll need backup. Quiet, but ready to move when it counts. I can call in a favor at the state level, but we'll need solid timing, visuals, and someone to give us the go signal from inside." James already knew what he was going to say next. "We have it. Or we might." At that moment, the bell above the diner door jingled, and James turned to see 2 familiar silhouettes step hesitantly inside. Mason and Tyler. They looked exhausted, but determined, like the weight they'd been carrying had become too heavy to bear alone. James waved them over, and they slid into the booth beside him. Frank gave them a measured look, not judgmental, just assessing. James placed a reassuring hand on the table. "Boys, this is Frank. He's someone we can trust." Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out another piece of folded paper, this time a copy of Vince's schedule. "We overheard him last night," Mason said. "He was talking about a final shipment, one he said couldn't be delayed. It's happening tonight, around midnight. He said it's the last one before everything moves out of state." Tyler added, "He's been nervous, real nervous, like something's not going according to plan." Frank nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "That's the window then. If we're going to catch him, it has to be tonight. Once he's gone, we might not get another chance." James felt the weight of that truth settle over him. Everything had led to this moment. Every observation, every night of surveillance, every second the boys had risked by stepping forward. They spent the next hour drawing up the plan. Frank would coordinate with two trusted contacts at the state police who would station unmarked vehicles in the vicinity of Liberty Gas. They'd remain hidden until confirmation came that the shipment had arrived. James would maintain his cover at the station, watching through the monitors, and signal Frank when Vince arrived and the drop began. Mason and Tyler would remain in a safe location under police protection until the operation was complete. Every step had to be precise. Vince wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends. If he even suspected something was off, he would vanish into the night, leaving them with nothing but shadows and rumors. But if they timed it right, they'd catch him red-handed, with product in hand, trackers active, and no room to escape. As the sun rose outside the diner, casting golden light through the dusty blinds, the weight of the plan settled across the table like a third presence. No one spoke for a long moment. They didn't have to. They each understood what was at stake, not just a gas station or a smuggling ring, but the lives of everyone Vince had touched, manipulated, or threatened. James looked at Mason and Tyler, their eyes filled with fear. Yes, but also something else. Courage. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "You changed how this ends." And as they left the diner to prepare for nightfall, James knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. He had truth on his side. He had evidence. And finally, he had a chance to put an end to the darkness that had crept into his town under the glow of his very own lights. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin and makes every sound feel louder than it should. At Liberty Gas, the neon signs buzzed quietly above the pumps, casting long shadows across the empty lot. Inside the office, James Walker sat at his desk, eyes glued to the bank of monitors. The cameras were all positioned, each feed crisp and steady. Pump 6 was fully in view. Nothing had changed on the surface, and that was the point. It had to look normal, unassuming, like nothing had been touched. But everything had changed. James had spent the entire day reviewing every detail of the plan, coordinating with Frank and the state police, triple-checking the camera angles, and making sure Mason and Tyler were secured in a safe location. All that was left now was to wait. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, and at exactly 11:45 p.m., headlights cut through the darkness. A black SUV rolled into the lot, smooth and silent, like a predator that knew exactly where to strike. James watched from the shadows of the office window as the vehicle came to a stop by Pump 6. The driver's door opened first, Vince stepping out with the same cold swagger James had seen in the park. His coat flared in the breeze, and his eyes scanned the lot with suspicion. Two more men emerged from the back seats, both large and broad-shouldered, one carrying a heavy duffel bag slung casually over his shoulder. James felt his heartbeat slow. It was time. He slipped the earpiece into place and whispered into the mic. "They're here." Frank's voice crackled back, low and steady. "Units moving in. Wait for my word." Outside, Vince barked something to the man with the bag, pointing to Pump 6. The man moved with purpose, kneeling beside the pump, just as the diagram had instructed. James stepped out from the office into the night. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He simply walked into the light like a man with nothing to lose. "Evening, Vince," he said, his voice calm. Vince turned slowly, eyebrows rising with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, look who finally decided to show his face," he said, mockery dripping from his tone. "You must really want to get yourself hurt." James didn't flinch. "I'm tired of watching you turn my station into a battlefield. Tonight, it ends." Vince's smirk darkened into a scowl. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, old man." Before he could take a step forward, sirens split through the air, sharp, commanding, and close. Red and blue lights exploded into the lot from all directions as unmarked cruisers skidded to a stop, officers emerging with weapons drawn. "State police, hands where we can see them." barked one of the officers as they fanned out across the lot. Vince froze mid-step, the sneer falling from his face. His two men turned to run, but didn't make it far. One was tackled to the ground by a pair of troopers, the other cornered behind the SUV. James backed away slowly as officers surrounded Vince, who raised his hands reluctantly. "You set me up," he hissed at James, venom in every word. "You're gonna regret this." James shook his head. "No, Vince. You're the one who underestimated what this place means. You thought you could use fear to keep people quiet. But not anymore." The duffel bag was seized, opened on the spot. Inside were rows of vacuum-sealed containers filled with a clear crystalline substance. One of the officers held up a field test kit, dropped a sample in, and after a few seconds gave a tight nod. Synthetic narcotics, high grade. The lot buzzed with activity as officers began cataloguing the evidence, photographing the scene, and processing the arrests. Vince was read his rights as he was cuffed and loaded into the back of a cruiser, still seething but silent now. The air smelled like fuel, fog, and finality. James stood near the office door, watching it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. He'd imagined this moment so many times over the past few days, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like justice, long overdue and deeply necessary. He looked over at Pump 6, the epicenter of so much fear and danger, and felt a cold wave of exhaustion wash over him. It was over. The game Vince had been playing in the shadows was now exposed in the harsh light of truth. Frank approached him with a tight-lipped nod, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, James. Without your eyes and those boys' courage, this never would have come together." James nodded slowly, eyes still scanning the lot. They were just kids. They didn't deserve any of this. Frank sighed. But they chose to stand up, and so did you. The officers loaded the evidence into a van, carefully sealing each container. The synthetic drugs were potent, designed to be moved quickly and quietly through distribution hubs like Liberty Gas. But not anymore. James took one final look at the duffel bag, now zipped and tagged, and turned away. There was still cleanup to do, and questions that would take weeks to answer. But tonight, the threat was gone. By the time the last cruiser pulled away, the lot had returned to silence. James walked slowly back into the office, locking the door behind him. He sat at the desk, not to review footage or plan a next move, but simply to breathe. The sting operation had worked. Vince was in custody. The drugs were off the streets, and Liberty Gas, his gas station, was safe again. Not just for business, but for everyone who counted on it as part of their daily lives. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, and with it came the first real peace James had felt in weeks. The following morning, sunlight crept slowly over the rooftops of Ridgewood, stretching long golden fingers across the pavement outside Liberty Gas. Inside the small office, James Walker sat alone at the desk, the same spot he had occupied just hours earlier during the sting. But this time, the tension in his chest had eased, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. He glanced toward the security monitors, now calm and uneventful, and then to the window, where soft rays of morning light filtered through the glass. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the silence wasn't ominous. It was peaceful. The weight he had carried for so long, the dread of what Vince might do next, had finally been lifted. But that peace came with reflection. James's mind wandered to the damage Vince had done, not just to the business, but to lives, especially the lives of two boys who'd nearly been consumed by a world they never asked to enter, Mason and Tyler. Their faces lingered in James's thoughts, not as symbols of guilt or failure, but as reminders of how easily good kids could get caught in the crosshairs of something much darker. He thought about how scared they were when they first walked through the doors of the station, whispering under their breath, unsure of who to trust. He thought about the look on Mason's face when he finally confessed, and the quiet fear behind Tyler's bravado. Vince had used that fear like a weapon, cornering them, manipulating them, and nearly turning them into criminals. But that wasn't how their story ended. They'd chosen to speak up, to risk everything for a chance at something better, and because of their courage, a much larger tragedy had been averted. James felt a swell of pride, not in what he had done, but in what they had overcome. The door chime rang out at precisely 8:03 a.m. And James looked up to see Mason and Tyler walk into the station. This time there was no fear in their steps, no tension in their shoulders. They looked different, not just because they were wearing clean clothes and brighter expressions, but because they carried themselves with something new, purpose. Mason gave a small, sheepish wave. "We figured you might need help cleaning up," he said. Tyler nodded beside him, holding a push broom in one hand and a box of trash bags in the other. James stood, smiled, and walked out from behind the counter. "You figured right," he replied, motioning them toward the pump area. "We've got a mess to clean up, and I can't do it alone." They moved together, side by side, sweeping debris, wiping down panels, and laughing quietly at things only kids their age could find funny. And James let them, because that's what freedom sounded like. There was something poetic about the act of cleaning up. It wasn't just about scrubbing surfaces or replacing signage, it was about reclaiming the space. Each movement, each swipe of a rag or toss into the trash felt like a small declaration. This station belongs to us again. Liberty Gas had always been more than just a place to buy fuel. It was a part of the community, a place where locals shared gossip, where travelers found a kind word and a hot coffee, where people felt safe. Vince had tried to poison that, turning it into something cold and dangerous. But now, standing there with two boys who had once been tangled in his scheme, James felt the roots of that purpose being restored. The station was breathing again, and this time it was stronger. By mid-morning, the lot was clean, the tools were put away, and the air buzzed not with sirens or secrets, but with laughter and the hum of cars pulling in for gas. Mason and Tyler sat on the curb outside, sipping sodas James had bought for them. They looked like regular teenagers again, exhausted but content, bruised by experience but not broken. James joined them, sitting down with a quiet grunt, his old knees protesting the motion. "You both did something really brave," he said after a long pause. "Most people your age wouldn't have had the guts to do what you did." Mason looked down at his drink, then up at James. "We just didn't want anyone else to get hurt." Tyler nodded. "And we didn't want to be those guys, the kind who run from stuff forever." James smiled. "You're not. You're the kind who face it and help fix it." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the normal rhythm of Liberty Gas returned. Regulars came in, unaware of the battle that had just taken place. Life moved forward, as it always does. But for James, Mason, and Tyler, everything had changed. Vince was behind bars, facing charges that would keep him far from Ridgewood for a long time. The smuggling ring he had built was unraveling, exposed by the very people he had tried to control, and in his place, something far stronger had emerged. Not vengeance, but resilience. James looked around the lot once more and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Liberty Gas was safe again.
And so were the boys who had nearly been lost to a man's greed, but had instead found their way back through truth, trust, and a little bit of courage. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. Every story we share shines a light on hidden truths, second chances, and the strength of everyday people.
Join our growing community as we explore powerful narratives that inspire change, build empathy, and remind us that behind every quiet moment, there's a story worth telling. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world.